Very briefly, just my background, I've been doing data analytics, product management, a little bit of business development for about 10 years. A lot of that has been actually in the medical imaging space. So I was at a few venture-backed startups. I did my tour of duty in Silicon Valley, as I like to say. I had my own startup, and I've been doing this kind of independent consulting work for almost a year and a half, like a year and some change, full time. And really my bread and butter, two things. One is helping cross-functional executive teams set and pursue good goals when there's a sudden change in uncertainty, which can be a challenge. Market conditions change, or you suddenly have a bunch of resources, right? You have a big equity financing round. If you're a VC-backed tech startup or something, you need to figure out how to reduce all the certainty that's much further out than you had dealt with before. I have a process that I run about this where I facilitate the teams on a weekly basis. And what I found out pretty early on, I would say the first time I did something that affected a client engagement was like November or December of 2022, where I was using GPT-3 to help with discovery interview analysis, like taking transcripts, user interviews, and then turning those into like insights that could impact product roadmap basically for one of my clients. What I realized was after doing lots and lots of these now, AI, generative AI, it helps you get to where you want to go 10 times faster, basically. A lot of caveats, a lot of nuances. Some things work much better than you expect. Some things don't. It's all very dynamic and changing, but it basically get people where they want to go, get clients where they want to go, and accelerate, hit the gas with the tech by using it in the right way. That's basically what I do. All right, so in kind of the simplest terms, how can we think about AI, generative AI, this new generation of software? And the simplest way I'd put it is that in some sense, it's actually not that new. It's totally continuous with what we've been seeing over the last 40 years, from mainframes to PCs to mobile, et cetera. It's just that computers used to only be able to crunch numbers and do very narrowly specified tasks. And now they can crunch words. So they used to be able to crunch numbers. Now they can crunch words. And they can also do simulated inductive and maybe even abductive reasoning. But numbers, words, that's the simplest way I'd put it. And soon computers will be able to crunch audio, images, video, and other more exotic modalities, which is going to be really interesting, I think, in healthcare in particular. And what that means practically is as the scope of what can be computed grows, that also causes the scope of what can be delegated to computers to grow. Now, how that scope grows, like what the frontier of what's possible looks like, I'm going to borrow this term from Professor Ethan Mollick at Wharton, but it's a very jagged frontier. Like it's often the case that these large language models and then soon the multimodal models and whatever the systems look like next, they are able to do things that are incredible that you'd expect, but they also fail in ways that are unexpected. So things that might seem to be easy for a human person doesn't do that well, but sometimes things that seem to be hard, it can do. And this has always been the case with computers, but as, like I said, the scope of what can be computed expands, it's just, we have to reset our expectations through lots of experimentation, right? In general, though, this is causing transaction costs to go down, which I think is going to have really interesting second, third order knock-on effects. Modes of communication, which I'll talk about in a little bit, like information liquidity, the speed at which things move, how quickly you can get good information and do search for stuff at a global scale, personalization, all that, unstick tacit knowledge and encode it into a software capital asset. It's just, things are really going to accelerate, I think. So that's the simplest way to think about it. Now, in terms of what this means practically, I'm not a huge fan of the extreme dystopian or the extreme utopian discourse. Like you hear a lot of people talking about existential risk, or that gets attention, or that we never have to work again, or merge with the machines, or something like that. I am personally a little bit skeptical about that, both of those. But what I can say for sure is that when things go right today, I think this will continue to be true just across, like I said, a broader spectrum of tasks and roles, knowledge work and whatnot. When things go right, you get 50% of your time back thanks to this technology via factored cognition. Okay. Which is like a fancy way of saying you break up all the tasks in a job, you unbundle a job into the discrete tasks, and you realize that there's just maybe like 50% of them you can now delegate to computers because they can crunch words. now. And so you're factoring, just like you would factor code or something like that. You're factoring this cognition that you're engaged in and then delegating and getting surplus resources back. And at the end of the day, our most limited resource is our attention. Okay. Now, this is a model I've developed, like getting better at using the tools myself, teaching clients how to do it, and getting to higher levels of need. There's a ladder of competency or sort of a pattern that I commonly see where it usually starts with AI as an eager assistant. And this assistant will really do one of three things, assuming that you actually know what you want it to do, which is pretty important. So you have a good idea of what you want it to do, not just the outcome, but also the output that it's going to produce and maybe even how to do it. And the analyst can retrieve information, not unlike the example that I showed where you take the transcript from this and you put it into Claude, and it's like analyzing, synthesizing, just like you would have someone do a pre-read. When you're actually doing work, it can help you do some of the work, write boilerplate code for GitHub's Copilot, things like that. Or it can act as a scribe where, as you're recording and digitizing, not just the output, but the process of creation, you can take all that tacit knowledge and encode it and share it in the organization. So instead of writing SOPs like you would do traditionally, just get the recording and make that available to someone and they can make sense of it through an AI intermediary, or you can create an SOP, get it 50% the way there through some kind of AI translation from the raw material. Okay. Now, if you don't know exactly what you want to do, so if that point B that you're trying to get to is like a little fuzzy, maybe you've taken in a whole bunch of new information, you're trying to make sense of it, you can accelerate that process by using AI as a thought partner. Quite literally, I'll do this a lot if I'm working on something hard where it's outside of my area of expertise, or I don't feel like I have my arms fully around problem, is I will just take all the information I can find and maybe some editorial commentary. This is thinking this and that. This is interesting. And I don't know what to do about it. And I'll just pop it into Claude or ChatGPT Plus, maybe go for a walk and dictate into it, and then literally have a conversation with the AI assistant until I'm satisfied with, yes, like I understand what's going on and then maybe in what I need to do next and what I want to do. At which point you can then use it as an assistant to produce the output or get the next thing done. And then the most advanced level is like AI becomes like electricity and it's just in everything that you're doing. You also know you're at this point because when the services go down or something gets messed up, you're like extremely upset. Just like when the electricity goes out, you're like, I can't work. Right? Like I don't know what to do here. So it's definitely possible to get there like pretty quickly. And that process is developing what I call like artisanal software. The cost of producing something new, like a one-off little automation or something is declining. I did product for a long time, managed cross-functional teams to take stuff 0 to 1, build prototypes. And oftentimes it would take weeks, sometimes months to get something into a user's hands. And of course, for really complicated enterprise systems, that's very different than just like a prototype, but trying something or getting something usable, at least usable enough that you can generate some information to there's there, that can happen 10, 100 times as fast as it used to. So I create software, artisanal software for clients, for myself, one off, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, going from idea to deployed very quickly, like minutes sometimes, which is crazy. And then ultimately, like the most advanced level of this, there's like some irony in that, or a paradox in that the more you use AI, the better you get at it. You eventually get to a point where you have to go to a frontier where the model, meaning kind of the sum of human knowledge, has never been. So you're genuinely doing a new thing. And that necessitates, like mindset wise, you carving out time to what I call think naked. So you take off the exocortex or the AI systems, IT and everything, and you just have unmediated time to think and convene with other experts to try to make sense of like new stuff. And that's a big part of the R&D process, right? You just have really gnarly problems you need to think about, just cogitate on and contemplate for. And then once you know what you want to do, you can bring it back, build stuff and so on and so forth. That's basically the way I think about kind of the levels of AI, generative AI competency. Now, there's something interesting because this is a loop video and more time, actually going to dive into this, but there is, I think, a very important question of if you get 50% of your time back, and this is true for your customers and users as well, something to think about is like, what are they going to do with all that extra time and attention? Or as a corollary to do it, if they could get to the same result, but like 2 to 10 times as quickly, so the cycle time is much shorter, what would they choose to do with the surplus? Or what would they then direct, their attention towards, your or the users, customers? Now, I found in practice, there is, of course, like some people will choose to not spend that time well, but most people, from what I've encountered in kind of professional settings, they do find things that they want to do, in part because they have all this energy back because they're not toiling to the same extent. Software becomes more usable, it becomes a more pleasant experience. So it's okay. I don't feel so exhausted that I can't work on something that's hard. If that makes sense. And so people tend towards, I've found, 2 big buckets, which are to either explore like things or people. So creation or relation would be the 2 big ones. And then contemplation and orchestration are interesting. It's like the deep thought. You're really far out in the frontier and you have to make sense of new stuff, create order out of chaos. Or orchestration, you have these semi kind of autonomous systems that are bespoke that you're managing. Not unlike that is a lot of what like a CEO does or the C-suite does, is you're thinking in systems, how to orchestrate all these different components and intelligent parts of the business, basically. Similar kind of thinking and like managing that complexity of emergent phenomena and all that kind of stuff. I think people will be just spending more time doing that, even as individual contributors. One interesting note to think about from a strategic perspective is, as you think about wiring up your business with AI, your products, all this good stuff, is the cultivation of a data asset and a way to visualize like the foundation models, right? So these are the GPT-4, Claude Pro or Claude 2, Google's Gemini, is they are more or less like maps. They're compressed maps of knowledge or like information space. And the thing is, as they take in more and more data and they use more compute to be more efficient, they are taking up a bigger and bigger footprint, like reality in some sense, right? And as they do that, the information that goes into it is almost instantly commoditized. And this is going to have some really interesting effects in fields like law, medicine, areas where it required really deep expertise, usually like some kind of expert intermediary to provide a personalized, at least a first cut of an opinion or recommendation or something like that. And I think this is not going to replace experts. In fact, it makes expertise more valuable because you're further out, but it is going to commoditize a lot of information that maybe wasn't considered commodity information or knowledge before. You should expect that this is going to expand. I always think it's like the Borg from Star Trek. So you want to think about strategically with businesses in general. There's this question of how do you develop this machine that cultivates a data asset, which you can think of as a unique kind of place out in this knowledge, this information space, where it's not only outside of the model, which means that you can charge for it. You have some market power, right? When people want it or they want to use it somehow. But you also need to figure out how to outpace say, for example, this is an example from a team that I was consulting. If let's say some of the internal know-how amongst some of these firms was not super differentiated, you can imagine that a competitor, if they get picked up, like they just get absorbed by OpenAI or something, they get all their data, then all of a sudden it's like overnight, your business, if it doesn't have differentiated data asset, information edge of some kind, not just an information edge, but like a knowledge edge, it's got to be practical in some way, then that really very quickly erodes your position in the market. So thinking about not just the data asset you have, but how to build a machine that will continue to serve customers at higher and higher levels of need. So it generates more and more valuable data that you can feed back into it and propel the progress outward. Abstract, but I think it's worth thinking about. It's more long-term. Okay. So here's my 4-step approach, basically, and this applies to both internal and external. If you're trying to get from point A to point B as a business, that's one way to look at it. If you're trying to get from point A to point B as a customer or as a user, that's another way to look at it. They have needs and goals and so on and so forth. Essentially, you want to map out like the blueprint, the user flows and stories and all that. I like to think of it as when it comes to corporation or something, it's like the guts of the machine. has information and value and money piping through it. So you draw the blueprint, figure out, and there's some qualifiers around this. What's the part where, coming back to the factored cognition bit, like what is the part of the process where it's really appropriate and valuable and reliable and everything to delegate it to machines that can crunch words? That's how you decide where you want to install this electrical outlet in the factory floor. Think of it as electricity, right? I'm a champion. This, of course, would be the end user for a product. And I think too, it's good to really raise your expectations about stuff. I think that ultimately these little changes compound to a 30 or 50% productivity boost overall. But in terms of like the individual task or like part of the workflow that you're automating or delegating, you should be aiming to get a 2 to 20x productivity boost. That's what I've seen in practice. Totally feasible. And like I was saying, there are many things you can automate, but if you can get 95% of somebody's time and energy back on something and produce a result of commensurate quality and cost, what they were getting before, then that's doing it, right? And then this is a quote from one of my clients who said it's once she's using the tools, what we built for her, it's like Pandora's box has been opened and she can't go back. And this just has a halo effect too, which is interesting. So even users or beneficiaries who are like a little bit skeptical or more conservative about this stuff, don't really want to change anything. When they see like the champion, there is a really nice halo effect amongst their colleagues and people just become naturally interested. In terms of like software or technology choices, the landscape is changing quite quickly. Some of the core decisions that you need to make, at least initially, are which foundation model to work with. There are really only 2 or soon 3 that are worth thinking about. So obviously OpenAI they were a leader. They have a relationship with Microsoft. And so Azure, their services are available there as well. And then AWS has that relationship with Anthropic, which is an interesting company. Their stuff is great. I use it all the time. I actually think they have an edge on OpenAI in a few interesting ways. I think we'll maintain it. And then, of course, there's Google. Google also has a relationship with Anthropic, but they're building their own things with Gemini, which is changing at a really crazy rapid pace. It's still not generally available, but that's another option to consider. Some of the fun stuff with the lab. One is clone delegation. So I actually have an AI clone you can check out if you go to Delphi, DELPHI.ai. You can talk to an AI version of me. It's got about 300,000 words worth of stuff I've published online over the past year and a half. It's got my voice. It's weird, but it works quite well. And actually I have a marketing guy he'll have some ideas, like some templates for content. Before coming to me, he'll actually talk to my clone first to see if this is something I've ever published about before, or do I have pre-existing content to share on this front. That's fun. He'll create first drafts based on that. And then I'll look at them and give him feedback. But essentially it front loads a lot of the work of just getting started. So I also did this from a sales perspective where I had somebody reach out and he wanted to see me in action. And so I got permission from one of my clients to share some of the working sessions that we did. And it's like 10 hours of stuff and he's not going to watch all that. And so what I did is I used AI to create a bunch of summaries, but I also took all the transcripts and I put it behind a chatbot and I gave the chatbot the prompt saying, hey, I'm going to give you all this transcript material. Don't share any names. I also told it, you're going to be talking to somebody, answering questions from this prospect. Don't worry about selling him. Just help him understand if, based on all the information, the things that I had done, first time your patron, whatever, the transcripts, if this would be a good fit for him. And then 2, I could see all the conversations that they're having as well. This tool, Chatbase, allows you to do that, which is cool. So it's like using this kind of new media to communicate in a different way. And it has impacts both internally, but also externally. And I think more and more so when it comes to like sales and marketing and product. And then I talked about my marketing guy. Now we have a really good groove where I just provide him a huge amount of raw materials. So this is a monologue of me just talking about things I'm interested in or top of mind. I'll go for a walk and I'll talk and record it. And I have the transcript and I have Claude has some ideas. I just attach those as screenshots. And then record a minute. There's a transcript there, put it on Slack, and I send it over to him. And then he just produces LinkedIn content. And I review it before it goes out, but it's a great kind of machine going. So I get a lot of time back through it. So that's a kind of fun thing. Another example is pretty much every single meeting I have now, I'll front load it with a thought partnership conversation with Claude, where my goal is to make this a very high quality experience and interaction for the other person. Right? Our time and attention is invaluable. Let's not repeat ourselves or waste time. So I take as much public information as I can find on the person, at least a LinkedIn profile. I just copy and paste into the Claude tool. If they have any podcast interviews they've done recently, long form YouTube videos, I take the transcript, written articles, like whenever I can find this out on the internet, I'll pop that in. If I have transcripts of previous meetings that we had, I'll pull that in as well. That's more valuable, more important. And then I'll add some context. I just tell Claude, hey, help me rigorously prepare. It does a really good job. It'll pull all kinds of interesting stuff. I say, okay, what about this and that? And have they talked about this? And what might they think about that? And something that would have been prohibitively expensive to do in the past, unless maybe you had a team of analysts or something doing this constantly, you can now do in just like a few minutes, which is pretty cool. And in practice, it's worked incredibly well. I have much higher energy levels, less context switching, et cetera. And then on the back end, getting coaching from Claude, like what are some blind spots? What are things that could have gone better and why? Act as my trusted advisor. What do you think about this and this? What are things I can do to go out of my way to address the top problem that this person is facing or likely to face if it's some kind of latent thing in the transcript? So I do that as well. And again, thinking about this from a product perspective, the core experience that somebody's having with one of the products, there's going to be that, but just remember there's this bookend like before and after where you can use these systems to filter and prioritize the information that deserves their attention so they can focus and work at the top of their license, so to speak, to take a phrase from healthcare. And then on the back end, when you have all that, what can you do with it to give them feedback on the quality piece or package it up and share it elsewhere? Or reincorporate it into, again, the data asset so that all of the users can benefit from everybody else getting better at what they're doing. It's a system of record. Some interesting ways you can think about that. Okay, so how do you actually do this? How do you do this stuff? There's a way in which you can think about how to use these tools generally or try to solve some of these problems. And it comes back to, again, getting from point A to point B. And the better idea you have of point B, the easier it's going to be. Ultimately, you can get there 10 times faster if you can construct the prompts. So the specifications to the foundation model to, given a bunch of inputs, produce an output that looks a certain way and is useful for some reasons, and so on and so forth. This is more on the technical side. This is a great tweet from Andrej Karpathy, former researcher now at OpenAI, I should say. I don't know how this is going to turn out in the long run, but I would just say in general, just like in the diagram, you want to push the prompt engineering. Few shot just means providing gold standard examples. Retrieval augmented few shot prompting is a fancy way of saying pulling additional information that the user didn't provide from a proprietary repo or your data asset. But by following this sequence, you can get the accuracy, you can get the quality up and not have to deal with the really crazy expensive challenge of hosting your own model or doing fine tuning or any of this other stuff. So that's my general recommendation. There is a shape to prompting, which is you instantiate a persona. And even this is getting commoditized soon, I think. But you instantiate a persona, you give context around the task or the problem at hand, you give it specific instructions, you give it gold standard examples from your proprietary knowledge repository, exactly how you want something to look. That includes formatting requirements. And then there are more sophisticated things you can do to simulate reasoning and even fine tuning eventually, but I wouldn't really worry about that too much. Next up, so where to insert generative AI into a particular workflow or like a product for a user. That's good. So here's how I would think about this. So where to install the first outlet in the house or in the product. So we talked about what is the goal we're trying to get to? How do you get there faster? What are the steps to get there? And then are there particular steps where you're crunching words where there's some degree of reliability, regularity, and it's somewhat complicated, or it's very particular. You need the specificity. Like there's some kind of expert knowledge that needs to be incorporated, and it's something people don't want to do. That's a good place to focus, right? So tasks you need to do, often, ideally, don't want to do, but know how to do. And that knowledge exists in gold standard examples, as well as in getting an expert to like really articulate how they do something, which we can do live during or with speech. And yeah, I'm going to skip over this, but there are different ways you can categorize some of these opportunities. But essentially, I would say stick to this. It's, you know how to do it. It needs to happen. People don't want to do it. Now, okay. So you go through this process as we're prototyping. We'll do some of this live, and eventually the system that you build that impacts the user can, of course, get pretty complicated on the back end. And we talked about some of the services and everything you could use to fill in these components. But long story short, they can crunch words, but soon they're going to get eyes and ears, right? So audio, images, video, input and output, the systems process it. And then maybe on the back end, they're doing retrieval augmented generation or using tools to process that information in a very specific way, return something, maybe they do a search, and then all that gets turned into an output that is of use to the user. And it's also worth noting that fundamentally this medium is discursive. So it's more like you're having a conversation with the product rather than what we're used to, where it's like simple inputs, click a button, you get the same output each time. You can build software that takes advantage of large language models that does that, but also now you have the ability to have it be discursive. So you can have multiple rounds of back and forth to help the person get to what they want to. And that's why the chatbot interface and this kind of idea of ambient or conversational software AI is gaining traction. Now I want to go to leave you with a couple of thoughts. So one is best practices. This, I like to say, it's like exercise and eating right. It's very simple, also hard, but if you do it, you cultivate the habits, the upsides, fantastic, and you can get started now. 3 best practices around this stuff. And this is more on the personal productivity side, but I do think it has application to product development and design as well. One is stop typing. So switch to voice as a primary interface. We've been trained or taught for decades now to use a mouse and keyboard as the primary way to input data into our personal computers. Once you make the switch to dictation, it feels incredible, much higher bandwidth in terms of input and output because you get stuff a lot faster. And so you can iterate, and you have a lot more energy. Like you'll see with the voice form, for example, instead of giving you even an option to type, you ramble, you talk, and it captures that information and allows me to process it. So you get a lot more, it's voluminous, it's rich, it's generally higher quality, or at the very least, you're more likely to find a gold nugget or a needle in the haystack. This is, for example, why the mining the podcast stuff works really well. But yeah, dictation, going verbal over typing, recording everything with an asterisk. But basically, if you can digitize all of your interactions through the product with the users or internally, that ends up becoming an asset that you can use. There's a sense in which people have been saying data is the new oil for forever. It's not been until now that we had the refinery technology, so to speak, to do things with it. And now we do. And last but not least, start experimenting. Really, it's very hard to know for a particular use case. I have a bit of an intuition at this point, but whether or not it's going to work. And so you just have to try. And I think when you try setting really ambitious goals and having extreme constraints in terms of time and effort and everything to really figure out if there's a there, try it once. If it doesn't work, break it down to pieces, try it again. If it doesn't work, break it down further. If it doesn't work on the third try, just move on. It's pretty likely that the core capabilities of the model at some point will get good enough that you can then do it. There are a lot of cases where there's probably a temptation to try to optimize or to engineer the ultimate solution, but I think in a lot of cases, it just makes sense to wait. And I can speak to that personally. I made a mistake a couple of times with the tech. It it gets good and it commoditizes basically whatever premature optimization you put into it. Now, in terms of how I work, this is usually how I work with clients. So I do one of these 2-hour workshops. Maybe we do another one if there's something that comes up where you want to do a deep dive. And then if the scope expands, I do like monthly retainers, basically with clients either providing advisory work or developing SOPs, providing product input and guidance to whoever the team lead is in the cross-functional team as you figure out how to build things out. And maybe that's enough, or maybe we keep going. This monthly retainer